Thank you so much for coming. Thank you. Welcome everyone. Welcome to my students and to those who are not my students yet and who will be. To my students in the course Sociology of Contemporary Islam, make sure that you sign in. But also if you're not my student, make sure that you sign in too. And so we can also stay in touch. So this is an event organized by Critical Studies of Iraq. We are very excited about today's event. So excited and happy and honored that Wazhmah Osman really made the trip from Philadelphia to come visit us at Rutgers-Newark. It is not her first time on campus, but we are always happy to have her, and we feel very honored to have her on our campus. So as many of you know by now, Critical Studies of Iraq is an initiative that I founded with scholars, feminists, activists who are mostly based in Iraq, in Baghdad in particular, but also in other parts of Iraq. It is based at the Sociology and Anthropology Department here at Rutgers-Newark. And so it was inaugurated in Baghdad in 2023 in a conference where we asked ourselves, so what is theory? What is it for? What is it about? And what would happen if we were to define what theory is? Who gets to theorize? What gets to be considered theoretical? And what happens when we take Iraq as a framework, as you know, the center of knowledge making, a framework to theorize from and not only about. So we ask ourselves a lot of questions that are very similar to the questions that Wazhmah Osman think about in her beautiful book. So I will introduce Wazhmah, say maybe a tiny word about the book, and then Wazhmah will speak, and then we'll have a conversation. Wazhmah really insisted that today's event was much more of a conversation, also between our different context and region. Let me fix this. So Wazhmah Osman is a filmmaker. It's back. An associate professor in the Klein College of Media and Communication at Temple University. She is, that's my definition, and you tell me if you agree, she's a transnational feminist scholar, an ethnographer, and her work is rooted in feminist media ethnographies that focus on the political economy of global media industries and the regimes of representation and visual culture they produce. She is the author of Television and the Afghan Culture Wars, brought to you by foreigners, warlords and activists, published in 2020 by University of Illinois Press. The book won the 2021 Activism, Communication and Social Justice Outstanding Book Award of the International Communication Association. Among many of her great work and publication, I will only mention a recent article published in 2024 titled Decolonial Transnational Feminism. So once again, it's such an honor to have you, and I'm looking forward to listening to you and to our conversation. This book for me is a turning point in the literature and the scholarship on what I would call Afghanistan studies, or the study of Afghanistan. It's really beautiful, it's really powerful. I learned really so much reading it. From its wide scope and analytical richness to its authors, whose positionalities, disciplines, and ethical engagements are all in tune with the decolonial perspective of the book. The book, and I think that's very important, it provides a lot of nuances to a lot of black and white debates, depth and original perspectives in its analysis of Afghanistan's social, political, economic, and intellectual histories. It is refreshing, it is eloquent, it is really powerful, and really a needed break from the dominant scholarship and the dominant discourse, whether in academia and outside academia on Afghanistan. And I think it does something that is very challenging for all of us who write and work on contexts that have experienced what I often call unspeakable or incommensurable violence. And we have this challenge, I mean, me thinking from about on Iraq, you thinking from about on Afghanistan. How do we write and speak and think as spectators of incommensurable violence? And we can think, of course, of the genocide happening in Palestine, of our entire region, of what is happening in Lebanon, what was happening until a day ago in Iran, of this context of this long war of terror that has really structured the lives of the people of our region. The people that you really center and the perspective that you really center in your book. I'll stop here. I'll let you all right.
You can all hear me okay? Thank you for coming, and I also wanted to thank my brilliant friend and colleague, Dr. Zahra Ali, for inviting me, as well as her critical studies of Iraq initiative. I've been part of a number of excellent conversations here, and it's really at the cutting edge of thinking about where we're at as a nation and where we're headed, and how that impacts other parts of the world, in particular the Middle East. And I also want to thank her because she's been very supportive of the book. It's part of what we're trying to do is write against the dominant narratives that are usually spoken and usually repeated in this echo chamber by the same people in positions of power, and to get books like Decolonizing Afghanistan, Zahra's incredible work about women in Iraq, Decolonial Pluriverse, and other ones, it's very difficult. And so to have supportive colleagues and other people to encouraging you along the way, it makes a big difference to get it out. I'm also looking forward to speaking beyond our context, because we're going to have a conversation about Afghanistan and Iraq, but also open it up to talk about, as Zahra said, about the current situation and where we're at right now with the wars in Iran and Lebanon and the ongoing war on the Palestinians and so forth. So, we'll open it up to you as well to talk about that. So I wanted to, give a little background about what motivated me, aside from being Afghan, and I identify as Afghan American, to write this book. And it has to do with, I grew up partially in Afghanistan, partially in Pakistan, and partially, mostly in the US, I would say. And I've over and over again heard the same narratives about people from our parts of the world that we're backwards, we're despotic, we're incapable of modernizing. We, cannot have democratic societies because we have these innate characteristics and qualities which are rooted in racism and all types of other problematic things. And so that was part of the reason. Another part was also just that most of my life, Afghanistan's been in the war. It was from a very early age. It was the Soviet invasion. Then there was, that was 10 years of occupation. That was the Civil War, and then we have the U.S. Forever War, which was over 20 years. And so it's been, almost 50 years of Afghanistan being in turmoil, and what the impact that's caused, not just for my family, but for everybody. So I remember as a child a peaceful Afghanistan. So how did we come from that to a place where currently, you know, Donald Trump can make statements like, I can, you know, erase Afghanistan from the face of this planet. And he's, you know, he's said similar things about other countries as well. So how do we get to that place where these outlandish statements can be made, but it turns out that it actually is also the reality, you know? So if the US wanted to, the US could actually, you know, remove the Taliban again. You know, they'd remove them in 2001 and they can do it again because we as a nation have that kind of military might. And what happens to these countries that once were peaceful, that once had societies and institutions and all of those things that have failed, right, at this point, is that you become, you know, what I call subject colonies, so that that can happen to you over and over again. Because these are the types of things that if you were part of a strong state, as opposed to a weak state, or what in academic literature they call Afghanistan a failed state. You know, these are terms from international relations and the Cold War. Sometimes they call them, these are theories of third world despotism, the rentier state. But my question is, how did a country become like that? And once again, it's not because we're backwards and we're savages and we don't know how to modernize or we are incapable of democracy. How do we, you know, explain all of these quote unquote interventions, wars, and imperialism? You know, how do we put these things in the context of empire and military might and economic might, from everything from sanctions to, you know, having incredible technologies of war? So those were the questions that really motivated this. And you know, these narratives and the way that they circulate have very consequential consequences. And what I mean by that is it impacts people from those regions, whether, you know, you're trying to apply for a job or, you know, get access to, you know, immigration or visas or other things. Those types of stereotypes and racist representations make it so that people from those regions cannot participate in the same way. And they have a way of continuing and reproducing themselves, you know, in a variety of, like even this day, like currently we're not directly involved in Afghanistan, but I hear these narratives over and over again that the US brought democracy to Afghanistan during the 20-year forever war and interventions, but, you know, Afghans were unable to keep it up, and, you know, it was because of Afghanistan that the US ultimately had to withdraw, right? So they keep perpetuating. And so in the book, I brought in 16 different, me and my co-editor, Robert Cruz, brought in 16 different voices of people who have cultural fluency. And I always say having cultural fluency is really important. So being able to speak the languages, being able to, you know, spend time in a place is very important in order to be able to understand it and speak about it. And so many people that speak about the Middle East don't have that, right? And so it's not that everybody in the book is Afghan or Afghan American, but they all have cultural fluency and have plenty of on-the-ground experience working there and researching there. You know, that produces completely different narratives. And so, yeah, so I wanted to highlight the diversity and agency of Afghan scholars, because a lot of times I go to these events and there's nobody from the region. And they also, a few years back, created the Afghanistan War Commission, Congress did, to figure out what went wrong or what happened in Afghanistan, because over $1 trillion were spent to remove the Taliban. They did, and then now we have the Taliban back. And there's not a single commissioner on the commission that's Afghan or Afghan American. And I know so many of us, you know, I mean, that you know, have that experience. They're scholars from different places, but not Afghan. So when I say these dominant narratives have consequences that are consequential, these are the types of things I'm talking about, is that there's this idea that we have so much infighting and sectarianism and other types of things that we can't even theorize about our own regions. So these were some of the things that, once again, motivated myself to, you know, start this. And I'll briefly speak about my chapter, and then we can open it up, and Zahra and I will have more of a conversation. In my own chapter, I reckon with the contradictions of US empire in the 21st century and analyze the two phases of American empire and its afterlives and deaths in post 9/11 Afghanistan, namely its simultaneous deployment of a vast infrastructure of development and nation-building infrastructure, which initially created a semblance of a functioning society with its propensity for incredible violence. Moreover, I examined the politics of inclusion and exclusion, and how some Afghans were selectively included into the imperial project, while others were targeted as insurgents and threats. And this is how interventions operate. They create us and them categories, invite some of us in while labeling others as insurgents. Empire works by segmenting and fragmenting society. Those who benefited from empire lived in securitized bubble in the capital of Kabul, what expats and everybody came to call as the kabubble. In the kabubble, people lived in gated new buildings, poppy mansions, and neighborhoods with names like Sharakat-Tilai or the Golden City. They were oblivious to the violence in the rest of the country. Some of those people who worked with the US were able to get out with special visas. This is, you know, in the in the withdrawal time. You know, including people like me who have dual passports. We could leave while everybody else was left in dismal and dangerous Taliban-controlled Afghanistan. If we are going to get out of the dystopia of foreign interventions and perpetual war, then we have to think outside of the insurgents, counterinsurgents, us and them mindset. Our liberation is embedded in a shared humanity and an ethics of care. We can't have some of us living in peace and progress while others are being bombed and living in poverty. Understanding and questioning imperial knowledge is an essential first step toward imagining an Afghanistan in which it has a different type of future beyond empire. Yeah, so that, yeah.
All righty, thank you so much. So let's continue this conversation. The book traces the ways that imperial violence and its technologies of power have shaped Afghanistan and its diaspora. It also explores how the diverse communities that make up Afghanistan have subverted, resisted, and also sometimes participated in this colonial project from the early 20th century to the present. I mean, there's some chapters that I think go back even earlier, but that's kind of the focus of the book, and the US invasion is really covered very well. I think the book really does a great job in analyzing the relationship between knowledge and power, how knowledge is weaponized for colonial interest, how knowledge itself is a weapon for colonial powers. You cite someone who said, I forgot the author, but who said, Afghanistan is a place studied to tame it.
Yes.
You say that this book's goal is to extricate the will to know from the will to conquer. Can you tell us more about this? Also about the way you personally navigated the field. being, like you said, in the heart of the empire in the US, also conducting ethnographies in Afghanistan. You mentioned, that you grew up, that you were born and where you lived. Can you tell us more about your personal trajectory and your experience as an ethnographer within the media industry post-US invasion and occupation in Afghanistan?
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe I'll start with the last part, my personal trajectory, and then we can move it out. As a filmmaker, and I worked in TV and an independent film and news, and also did some video journalism, and then went to grad school 7 years after undergrad, because in many ways I was just, had very negative experiences in the news world where people who had knowledge, who were from those regions or on the ground experiences, they were sidelined, and we would usually have, these what we call talking head experts who were very removed from those places, but they were considered to have more of an authorial voice. And so I went back to first get my master's, and I actually have my undergrad from Rutgers as well. But I went back to get my MA and then later my PhD because I thought, okay, maybe academia would be different. Not the case.
You thought?
Yeah, I mean, mind you, I was much younger then. I remember when I was doing my master's in Middle Eastern Studies, I won't name names, but I had a professor who just had such a, I'm trying to figure out how to put it, had like such negative, like he was an expert on Afghanistan and he had written many, many books on Afghanistan. He himself was, American, but the things that he said about Afghans, some of the things I shared in my talk earlier in my intro were just shocking to me, that here's this guy who, spent his whole life researching a people, and he has such negative, perceptions of us as a people. And so it became very clear to me that academia is very much embedded in, in government, in policy, in empire, and those who repeat or perpetuate these kinds of narratives and discourses are the ones that move up the ladder, whether that's the ladder of getting an assistant professor job and tenure and this, and those who challenge it are sidelined, over surveillance, doxxed, so forth and so on. So that was a very rude awakening for me. So that's my own personal trajectory. And then in terms of, how I think both, what's called the heyday of colonialism, back when you had the British Empire, and before that you had, the Russian Empire. And when we look at today's empire, that's not that different in that there was always emissaries or people from those countries, So I would be a prime, candidate to be brought into the project because, we're considered insider outsiders. We speak both languages, but we can also, communicate with the government here. So we're what's called, hyphenated people. And so I don't think, I guess what I'm saying is, let me put it this way. There are people who, one of the things I studied in my first book, Television and the Afghan Culture Wars, is that many of the development projects that were initiated over there were with U.S. government money, including USAID. And so there was a good number of people from the U.S., including Afghan Americans, doing good work. And there's been so much criticism of NGOs and the development apparatus and how it's tied to the statecraft of war, and one goes in with the other. But the truth of the matter is that some of them were very generative and produced good things. So I'm very much for, you know, having these kinds of transnational and cross-cultural collaborations. But I think the danger lies when the people who become a part of the imperial project, even if they were from what we call the subaltern category, so even if you're from, you're quote unquote native, but then you become a part of it, is when you adopt that mentality of us and them is so dangerous, because, you know, I did like, you know, multi-year research. Like I was there for, you know, many years during the US interventions and war. And most of the time I was in Kabul, in the capital, which is where I was born and where I'm from. And I would meet people who are working with the US government, everything from translators to, you know, and other positions. And they would be completely oblivious about what's happening in the rest of the country, you know, or they wouldn't, oblivious is not the right word. They knew, it was on the news that, you know, there was a, you know, drone bombing or regular bombing or conventional bombing, and this part of Afghanistan or this part, this many people were killed, you know, and the line between who was a civilian and who wasn't was always iffy. Like one group would say no civilians were hurt, another group on a different media outlet would say it was mostly civilians, you know, and sometimes the US would take responsibility and it was investigated, and sometimes it wasn't. But that's all to say, they would say, oh, those people who are getting killed over there are not us, you know? Wow. Like they had bought it hook, line, and sinker, as they say, right? They had bought into the narrative that those are insurgents, those are terrorists, those people deserve to, and it doesn't matter if they're civilians or they're not. It was away from them. They were in this green zone, they were in the kabubble, you know, there was, you know, fancy hotels and restaurants and parties and things to go to, and so there was disconnect. And to me, that was shocking, because I was like, no, I'm sorry, but those are not only fellow Afghans, but they're fellow human beings, you know? And we can't live like this over here, and that's happening over there. So I think that's where the danger comes in with you know, some people being included into the project of empire and others being excluded, is that people also in their mind don't realize, you know, the impact of that. And that ultimately had a big factor to why, you know, the development aspects or the nation building aspects of the US interventions did not work, you know?
Yeah, I think self-alienation, I mean, the role also of the elite in, you know, in our context, in our region, is to be really pointed out. For sure, but it's also a complicated debate, I feel. There's a lot of critique of like the diaspora in the case of Iraq, for example, because the people who came with the US-led coalition were actually people who have lived in Iraq, who hadn't lived in Iraq for decades. So a political, I mean, families, group of people who were exiles for some of them 2 decades. And there's a lot of literature, a lot of criticism of the diaspora, and I, you know, a lot of you also are hearing it when it comes to Iran. There's this whole discourse stigmatizing the diaspora. But there's something that always, you know, I think about, although even the discourse within Iraq, it's interesting because there's such a gap between the ways in which these issues of imperialism and, you know, militarism are talked about in our region and how it's talked about, you know, here. I feel that Iraqis in Iraq tend to focus very much on the critique to the elite that came to power, and of course, I mean, we still have very strong social movements. We've had an uprising in 2019 critiquing the entire political system put in place by the US invasion in 2003. But however, people tend to really point out the responsibility of those who collaborated, who sold the country, and who then put Iraqis through cycles of state collapse and violence. But there's always this question that I think we also as scholars can ask is, I mean, after all the bad things we can say about our elites and those who collaborated, they've inherited a system that was like structurally, and there's a lot in your book about that, dysfunctional and made to be dysfunctional. In Iraq, it is the institutionalization for the very first time in Iraq's history of ethno-sectarian identity as the basis of political representation. Basically, after 2003, you could not define yourself as just a citizen. To exist politically, you had to define yourself through the lens of, through being Sunni, a Shi'i, an Arab, a Kurd, a Muslim or a Christian. And that's something that was really imposed by the US. And you talk about that very much, and I think that's really in the core of the book, about this relationship between this weaponized knowledge, which is not even a knowledge, it's really orientalizing, it's blatantly racist about our context, and then imperial powers coming. And so in Iraq, it's this American vision of Iraq. I mean, if we look at it historically, actually, American segregationist intellectual, so-called, or political figures have played a role, actually, in influencing certain policies in our region, in Iraq in particular. But like, it is the American vision that Iraq is a country made of Arabs, Kurds, and Muslims, and Sunni and Shia. Not that we don't have this diversity, and not that we don't have tension, and that the Ba'ath dictatorship instrumentalized these tensions, but never before the US invasion were these differences institutionalized and became really the political system. In the US, it would be the equivalent of institutionalizing racism, in the sense that you do not exist politically if you don't define yourself as of a certain ethnic, religious group. So and with hyper-militarization, you talk about that as well. The country was plunged into really cycles and cycles of sectarian violence that brought ISIS, etc., etc. But I want to go back to what you said about also the field itself. And I really love this. I think it's very important that you say, because we tend as academics to say that, and maybe you guys, I'm talking to my students as well, we feel that academia offers something different than the media, right, or the mainstream media, and we pride ourselves for bringing a more nuanced picture. I do think that it is there somehow, and you can find in academia books and scholarship and perspectives that are much more complex than you find in mainstream media. However, you also find very bad scholarship. And interestingly, when it comes to our region has been studied mostly through the lens of so foreign policy, political science. So Middle East Studies department are mostly political science department, and we as ethnographers have a very, very big problem with political science. Not all political science. There's also feminist, radical political science, but this is not the hegemonic discourse, right? So the hegemony is that Iraq, Afghanistan, our region are not studied for what they are. They are studied for the purpose of US foreign policy. So somehow the US is the center. It is about the US. It is about US strategy, US military strategy. It is about the US. It is not about us. So it is orientalizing, but then it also, orientalism and this blatant racism has real consequences. and in creating this kind of what I would call, I don't know, fake scholarship of people. I mean, in the case of our region or the Arab world, I mean, there's so many until now scholars who are top specialists of our region and who don't speak Arabic. And we are not here to say that, you know, you have to be from the region. We have, you know, we discuss that a lot in our transnational feminist kind of work and conversations, that, you know, being from the region also doesn't mean that you don't have a problematic positionality. Positionality is complex. There's no authentic or perfect positionality. However, it's about the nature of the engagement. It's about accountability. It's about how, you know, how some people can circulate in and out our region. You know, do interviews and fieldwork and just leave and then decide to study something else without any form of accountability to the people they interview, or at least to the scholarly community that, you know, or cite, you know, local, or I mean, the idea of a local scholar is also problematic, but actually cite the scholars who actually live there. So there's a lot in your book, and I think also maybe you can tell us more about how you chose the people, the authors, who are, you know, some are academics, some are journalists, some are artists actually, and it seems that they all have, you know, a substantial relationship, engagement with Afghanistan, and that this engagement did not become a currency. Because that's the thing, I feel, what I feel in the case of Iraq is that Iraq became a currency for scholars, for journalists who build their entire political career using Iraq, whether actually it's in progressive terms, like whether they had, you know, imperialists or anti-imperialists, but they build their entire career talking about Iraq as a thing, as a thing that they are so distant from, and they don't feel accountable to. So maybe also you can, you know, tell us about that. You also mentioned Linda Tuhiwai-Smith, and when she says nobody asked this question other than decolonial scholars about, you know, who will benefit from this research, whose interest does it serve. I feel that a lot of students who come to me who want to study Iraq or the Middle East, you know, this push also, this interest, the why this question, and why somebody who has nothing to do with the region, doesn't speak the language, has no ties, or why suddenly, maybe when the region is on the news all the time, why suddenly this student is interested in studying Afghanistan.
Yeah, I mean, really, you know, important issues that you're raising. Yeah, I mean, maybe I'll say this much, that there's so many people in Afghanistan who are doing incredible research and work, right? There's scholars, there's filmmakers, there's artists, there's novelists, radio personalities, activists, and, you know, people just don't know about them or don't hear about them, right? And so there's a privilege when you can speak on behalf of others, and that's what we do, right? And that's what scholars get to do. And, you know, part of, I think, what you've done with your books and I've done is try to bring those voices, because we can understand them. You know, we have that cultural fluency and share that with the rest of the world. It's just that oftentimes I find the people who are in positions to control the narratives and in positions of high positions in academia and other places don't really care about those voices. You know, it's sometimes they think they don't exist, but even if you present it with them, they tend to sideline it. You know, I've had like a number of you know, back during the US forever war in Afghanistan, I had a number of journalists reach out to me because there were so many different things that happen around Afghan women. And, you know, we went in with this idea of saving Afghan women from the Taliban. And so I would always say, you know, can I put you in touch with some of the, you know, Afghan women scholars and feminists and activists that I know over there? Because, you know, they're the ones that really know. They have so much to say about it. And so I think that's like there's a hubris there's a hubris that comes with a pridefulness that comes with being an empire or being a very powerful country. And there's a hubris that comes with being a scholar within that kind of country, right? And so, and then what happens is that there's a type of theorizing that's very top down, right?
Yeah.
So that we're going to solve your problems and make sense of it while it's useful for us. But then if things go wrong, it's all your fault, right? And that's something I saw over and over again, right? Is what's considered valuable knowledge or knowledge that is valuable is very surprising to me, you know, because to me, it's those people who are in it, who are experiencing these situations, who have the best solutions and the best ways out of, you know, all these horrible predicaments that our regions find ourselves in, right? And yet those are the people we sideline the most. And then you send people like us, and we've talked about this before. I consider myself Afghan American, and you consider yourself Iraqi, French American, maybe.
I don't know.
Okay, because you've been,
Yes.
But you know, we're kind of like the in-between emissaries of that, and so you do the work and show them like there's all these people doing incredible work, and then it's still like no. We have our own theories, you know, our theories are this, and then they sometimes will find a few examples to make their argument. But I find it not just problematic, I find it very dishonest, and beyond dishonest, as I said before, it's very dangerous, you know,
very dangerous.
because it's a type of paternalism that, you know, we know best, and we're going to determine your future. And it also allows for perpetual, non-ending war and violence in the region, because if everybody buys into the idea that we are incapable of democracy and we're incapable of living in a pluralistic society, then it sets it up so that you can bomb Iraq multiple times and invade Iraq multiple times. You can bomb Afghanistan as much as you want, or, you know, into oblivion, as our current president said. And you can do that over and over again, and that's okay, because those people aren't really people at our level of understanding. And that's why I think it's really important to, you know, we're both ethnographers, and we do work and we interview people to share those voices.
Yeah, it's a very important point. I think also, I think it's a very timely conversation because, I mean, when there is a war, I mean, also I feel like the term war is really to be problematized, and I call it a hiding place. Because when people in this country say the Iraq war, I mean, it was an invasion and occupation based on lies and a propaganda about weapon of mass destruction. And so where is the war here when people talk about the Israel-Hamas war? I mean, it's an ongoing genocide. And so the term war, even like, I feel like the war experts blossom in times of incommensurable violence. And it's also sometimes disappointing because, like you said, I mean, we're ethnographers, we also, the type of analysis that we tend to offer, also as feminist scholars as well, transnational feminist scholars, is a different type of engagement. The conversation is more nuanced. We insist, for example, on the level of the everyday, on everyday people. as opposed to the like you said, the overarching narratives. But unfortunately, people love these experts. I feel like that's really something I'm getting more and more frustrated, and sometimes I feel like maybe we should try to be a little bit like, sound a little bit like these people who predict the future, these political scientists that we see on all the channels. And even, I will have to say, like, not only in the conservative, like even in some, let's say, more lefty or progressive oriented places where you have these people who they have the answer to everything. And they talk like this, so Iran said that. And so in Iraq, you know, like this like with the eye, like the way they talk. And they can even be progressive, like, and so this is what happened, and the state said that, and the commander, and they have this like explanation to everything, and they predict. So this type of analysis is very popular. And it's so different. It's really what we try to do and offer is like in-depth conversations that have nuances, that don't give answers, but put people, let's say, at the level of the everyday of these societies, of these groups, that we want to deeply humanize, or, you know, deeply also want to, you know, equalize experiences. So, and I'm not sure sometimes what to do about it. Like, there's also a feeling that sometimes our work also don't circulate that much because they're not legible. They're not as legible to, even sometimes to our students, but to, let's say, the public. Then the very superficial political sciencey, like really the cliches, the white man political science from an Ivy League who knows everything and who talks really like, generalize, homogenize everything, and it's still popular. That's the thing. I mean, I feel more than 20 years into this war on terror, this war of terror, we see the same thing coming up, like every time in the past month and a half about Iran, the same type of discourse. And, you know, as feminists, as ethnographers, you know, I found it challenging. How do we still, you know, do work that is impactful and stay like, and I think we should also refuse to stay too much in the bubble of academia, and try to have a little more impact. Yeah. So yeah,
no, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, as you were talking, I was thinking about all the famous Middle Eastern scholars who are not from the region and don't speak Arabic, don't speak Farsi, don't speak Pashto, don't speak any of the languages, but they're famous and they've written like thousands and thousands of books, and they're, you know, they're also involved with the State Department, and they get the big grants, and they're sometimes on TV as experts, and they have this academic speak and this way of talking about theories that, yeah, I mean, you were joking that maybe we should adopt it, but, you know, hopefully not. But, you know, like they have these grand narratives that sound very catchy to people, and they have this sense of entitlement or sense that we can figure out the Middle East, you know, and they couldn't figure it out for themselves. But, you know, I'm thinking, as you were talking about the clash of civilizations, right? Which is, some of you might be familiar with, it's Samuel Huntington's famous book, which then other people talked about, which he had this theory that there's distinct civilizations, and some of them just haven't evolved. And that's why there's this clash, right? So the Muslim world, which is so different in different parts of the world, but it just becomes this monolith, is always going to be at odds with the Western world. You know, once again, these monoliths. But
this black and white.
But people love this type of language, or, you know, what I was talking about earlier, the failed state, or the rentier state, or third world despotism. These are all theories in political science and international relations and certain other fields that came out of the Cold War and some other, wars before that. So it's a way of explaining things. These countries are always going to be failed states, and there's always going to be despotism in the third world. And the rentier state, the idea is that, they're always going to be dependent on foreign money because they're incapable of having a productive economy and so forth. And they just catch on, and this is what I call the dominant echo chamber. They cite one another, they repeat it, they get the book contracts, it gets into the mainstream, it gets into the Hollywood movies, and these stereotypes and terrible views of our parts of the world just perpetuate, right? And the type of work you and I do is we're both scholar activists, so we do activism as well. We're involved in other, media and music and other things, and we're trying to bring voices from, from the grounds up, people, everyday voices, people's everyday lives. What does it mean to live in a place where you're constantly being bombed while trying to go to school or something like that, right? So those are the types of voices we're trying to raise, but we don't put it into a theories of, I have a theory to explain all of those things. And I think we need new language, and maybe what we should do is in challenging some of these grand narratives of, the clash of civilizations and all the other ones I mentioned, maybe we need to come up with, the opposite of those words, So if they're talking about our parts of the world are always involved in sectarianism, and one of the reasons why Iraq and Afghanistan might never be able to be democratic countries is not only because we hate women and we're terrible to women, but also because we hate different ethnic groups and different races and different religious groups within our, which is, not the case. We have history of living together and having, cities like Baghdad, cities like Afghanistan that you grew up in as a child and I did, were plural. People had neighbors. I had neighbors from all different ethnic groups, and we had Sikhs and Hindus and all different people, because it's cosmopolitan cities. So how does it happen that we're always shown in these ways of being tribal and having no tolerance for other groups of people? And I think part of what happens is that there's a type of projection, right? And Gruwal and other scholars have talked about the outsourcing of patriarchy or the outsourcing of racism. So we don't want to think that we have any problems with women. As the Epstein files are showing us, it's horrific. It's horrific, the experience of women and girls in this country, how many rapes happen, and the level of violence on so many levels if you look at the statistics. But we don't want to look at ourselves, so we're going to go save you. We don't want to look at the racism here. We don't want to look at what happens here, so we're going to talk about how you all can't live in a pluralistic society. And the other thing I want to highlight here is that, the people that were funded during the Cold War in Afghanistan were some of the most, and by funded I mean funded by the US government, most of the time covertly to fight the Soviet Union, were some of the most extremist elements, worst elements of Afghan society, who, for generation reformers and people in government were trying to keep at bay. But they're the ones that got the weapons. They're the ones that got, the funding and the aid and all of that. And so empire thrives on divide and conquer. That's not to say we don't have those problems. We do, but we can figure them out just like anybody else can.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, thank you. I'll have just one final question, and then we can open to the audience. The third part of the book is really my favorite part. Because this is the part where you you have artists and writers, scholars who are really, I mean, the title is speaking back to empire. So in this third part, you have basically people who are talking about internal debates, internal so literature that is not available, not written in English, works of literature and arts from Afghani artists in Afghanistan, and defining kind of the way they see the world, making knowledge about the world from their own perspective. And somehow I feel like this is really the part where the decolonizing methodology of the book really thrives, because, and somehow I feel it's not really, because the problem with speaking back to empire, and something we talked about a lot in kind of transnational feminist debates, speaking back to empire also often means that the empire stays the center of our thinking. Somehow, a lot of scholars who are post-colonial scholars, who are based in the US, and we all carry this guilt and this feeling of responsibility that our tax money is going to invade our homes and destroy our region. And there's this sense that the work and the critique always goes back to the US. And I think that in the third part of the book, we have people whose reality is not the US, whose center is not the US, right? And this is, maybe you can say something about, going beyond US centrism, decentering the US in our, I think going beyond dichotomous thinking is very, very important, as you pointed out. But how do we develop, a decolonial perspective that does not recenter the heart of the empire?
Yeah, that's a great question to wrap up and open it up on. I mean, I think there's a few different things to consider. So one thing I'll say is that I did want to engage with the US and center it in certain parts of the book, but you're right, in the last part we didn't. Mm-hmm. We brought very much Afghan voices, Afghan perspectives on through art and literature and media and things like that. And part of that centering of the US is because I think that too many people here are not making the links or not admitting where we are as a country, right? And we are in the belly of empire. And so it was important for me to make those connections for people, and that the project, I think there are, many, okay, let me put it this way. The desire to help other people, which is what part of the war in Afghanistan was premised on, was nation building and rebuilding a war-torn country, is not the problem. I think there were people who are genuinely doing good projects from here and other places that had really important impact in developing the media sector for various, educational institutions and, in different sectors. But I think there's also this inability to couch it all in this language of benevolence, right? And that there's this still, in the US, I find, how do I want to state this? There's a refusal to look at the big picture and see us for what we are, And sometimes I'll speak, and this is not for all American scholars or all Russian scholars, but sometimes I'll speak with Russian scholars from Russia, and they'll repeat very much similar narratives as American scholars, and that we came to Afghanistan to help you, to save you, to build all these infrastructure projects, and they cannot make the link you know, because everything in their archive, everything they've been told is that that was the narrative for that, right? They can't make the link that the Soviet Union was an empire. To this day, they cannot, right? There's ways of trying to rehabilitate it as this leftist utopia of, you know, and that's not to say maybe there was some aspect of trying to set itself up as something alternative to the West, but it was an empire. It invaded many countries. It killed, you know, many people, destroyed lives. And I find that same kind of reluctance in the US, where people, you know, like there's one scholar who went as far as to say we're empire light. We're imperial, we have some imperial ambitions, but we're still very, you know, benevolent. We're still doing, you know, we're not like the empires of back then. But if you start to look at what's actually happening and the impacts of war, and the damages beyond the afterlives of it too. So there's the bombs being dropped, and then there's the ways it permeates and destroys generations in so many different ways, right? And so, yeah, and I think that was one of the you know, ways to that I wanted to kind of help people make those connections and see the staggering facts on the ground. And I think that's why a good part of the book we focus on that, is because I did want it to be also for American audiences. And in a way it's decolonizing Afghanistan, but I also want it to be decolonizing America and the US, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
But to your question, I think the last part of the book really focuses on that. And to be honest, that part blew my mind too. You know, when I read those chapters for the first time, like the literature by Afghans in Afghanistan and also in the diaspora and how they make sense of these things is incredible. Or the artistic work that's coming out, you know, about talking back to empire is just so important. And I can give so many examples that the level of creativity and the skill and all of that is incredible. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Let's take a question from our beautiful audience.